What's the inspiration behind that?
When I saw it in the field, it was like, I've got to do something with that, and I wanted to do a military tribute. And when you look at it, I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at the tailgate on it.
There's a particular kind of television personality that audiences never quite get over losing. Not the ones who burn out publicly, not the ones who got caught in some controversy, and not the ones whose shows simply ran out of ideas. The ones that sting the most are the ones who were genuinely good at what they did, who made viewers feel something real, and who then quietly stepped away without giving anyone a satisfying explanation. Stacey David belongs to that category. For years, he was the most trusted face in automotive television, the kind of host who made a garage feel like a place where real things happened to real people. And then, almost without warning, he was gone from the mainstream spotlight. The real reason behind that disappearance is more complicated and more revealing than most people realize. And understanding it means understanding something true about what television actually does to the people it makes famous. Before any camera ever pointed at him, Stacey David was already the kind of person who could not leave a machine alone. He grew up in Boise, Idaho, surrounded by the kind of mechanical curiosity that either gets channeled into something productive or gets a kid into trouble, and in his case it went in the productive direction. From an early age, he was pulling apart engines, working on go-karts, messing with motorcycles, and developing the foundational instinct that separates a real builder from someone who only looks like one on television. That instinct is the ability to look at something broken or unfinished and see the path forward, not just the destination, but each individual step that connects the beginning of the project to the end. That kind of thinking cannot be faked in front of a camera, and it cannot be learned in a week before a shoot. It comes from years of making mistakes in a real shop and figuring out how to fix them. What makes his background even more interesting is that mechanical work was not his only serious pursuit. Stacey also built a genuine career as a musician, relocating to Nashville, Tennessee, and working as a professional guitarist doing session work and touring with various acts. That chapter of his life tends to get overlooked in discussions about his automotive career, but it matters more than people give it credit for. Musicians who are also skilled craftsmen tend to approach physical work differently from pure mechanics. They think about rhythm, about pacing, about how individual elements combine to create something that feels unified. They understand that the difference between good work and great work is often less about technical correctness and more about intention. Stacey brought that sensibility into every build he ever put on camera, and is a large part of why his vehicles had personality rather than just performance specs. He was not assembling parts. He was telling stories in steel and paint. When Trucks launched in 1999 on TNN, the timing turned out to be genuinely significant. Automotive television had existed for years in various forms, but the genre had not yet found its identity. There were plenty of shows about racing and plenty of segments about new car releases, but there was a real gap in programming that treated the act of building and modifying vehicles as something worth watching in depth. Trucks arrived into that gap with Stacey as its central figure, and the combination worked almost immediately. He had the technical knowledge to be credible, the communication ability to be accessible, and the genuine enthusiasm to be watchable over the long haul. Viewers who knew nothing about suspension geometry or welding techniques could follow along with him because he never talked down to them and never skipped over the parts that required real explanation. He assumed the audience was capable of understanding complicated work if someone took the time to walk through it properly, and that assumption turned out to be exactly right. The builds themselves became cultural touchstones within the automotive community. Copperhead, the 1967 Chevrolet C10 truck that became one of the show's signature projects, was not simply a restoration with some performance upgrades. It was a statement about what the relationship between a builder and a vehicle could look like when genuine creativity was brought to the process. Crazy Horse, the custom 1966 Ford Bronco, carried its own distinct identity and helped generate enthusiasm for classic Broncos long before Ford's modern revival made them fashionable again. These vehicles were memorable not just because they were well built, but because Stacey gave them narrative context. He explained why specific choices were made, what problems those choices solve, and what trade-offs came with different approaches. Watching him work felt educational in the way that the best teaching always does, meaning you absorbed information without feeling like you were sitting through a lecture. That quality, the ability to transfer genuine knowledge without making the audience feel inadequate, is rarer in television than it might seem. The medium has a tendency to reward performance over substance, and automotive television in particular developed a strong appetite for drama, conflict, and spectacle as it grew more competitive. Shows discovered that staged arguments between shop workers generated more immediate reactions than careful explanations of fabrication techniques. Artificial deadlines created tension that smooth, well-paced build segments could not easily match. The loudness of the genre started to increase, and the pressure on individual shows to match that volume increased along with it. This is the environment that Stacey was working inside during the later years of his run on trucks, and it is an environment that eventually created the conditions for his departure. The specific details of how his time on the show ended have never been fully laid out in any official statement from either Stacey or the network, and it would be inaccurate to claim certainty about internal conversations that were never made public. What is known, and what has been consistent in everything Stacey has said publicly over the years, is that his departure was connected to changes in the show's direction that did not align with what he believed automotive television should be doing. The show that had been built around genuine education and authentic builds was experiencing increasing pressure from commercial interests, sponsor requirements, and network preferences for faster, more polished content that moved away from depth and toward spectacle. For someone whose entire credibility rested on the authenticity of what he was putting on screen, that shift was not a minor creative disagreement. It was a fundamental conflict about the purpose of the whole enterprise. What happened next is the part of the story that says the most about who Stacey David actually is. Rather than staying on a hit show while quietly compromising the values that made it work, he left. There was no farewell episode constructed for maximum emotional impact. There was no public statement designed to win a narrative battle with the network. There was no drawn-out media campaign to position his departure as someone else's fault. He simply moved on, which in the context of the television industry is genuinely unusual behavior. Most people who reach the level of national recognition that Stacey achieved on trucks do everything in their power to hold on to that platform, even when holding on requires accepting conditions that erode the thing that made them valuable in the first place. The willingness to walk away from that level of visibility, without turning the exit into its own performance, reflects a clarity of purpose that most entertainment careers never develop. In 2007, he launched Stacey David's Gears, and the nature of that project explains a great deal about his motivations. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward return to automotive television, but the structural difference was significant. Through his production company Rattletrap, Stacey controlled the show himself, functioning as producer and director in addition to on-screen host. That ownership changed everything about how the work could be approached. The pacing of builds could reflect the actual complexity of what was being done rather than fitting inside a predetermined template. The choice of projects could follow genuine interest rather than sponsor compatibility. The explanations could be as detailed as the subject required rather than as brief as an edit demanded. Gears gave him back the things that Trucks had originally provided at its best, with the added protection of creative control that meant no outside pressure could gradually push the show away from its purpose. Over the course of more than 200 episodes, Gears explored a wider range of projects than Trucks had typically covered. Custom builds, restorations, hot rods, off-road vehicles, vehicles inspired by film and television, family projects, and builds that honored military veterans all appeared in the show's catalog. The variety was possible precisely because Stacey was not answering to a network that needed the show to fit a specific demographic profile. He could follow the story of a vehicle wherever it led, which meant the educational content could genuinely vary from episode to episode based on what each particular project actually required. That flexibility is a direct result of the choice he made when he left Trucks, and it is the clearest evidence that the departure was not a failure, but a deliberate repositioning. The broader automotive media landscape continued changing around him throughout this period. Cable television's grip on the genre weakened as streaming services grew and YouTube became a serious platform for automotive content. The competitive environment became more extreme in every direction. Shows fought for attention with increasingly dramatic premises, bigger budgets for spectacle, and formats that prioritized viral moments over sustained quality. Creators who built audiences on YouTube often succeeded by combining personality, humor, and accessibility in ways that traditional television had never quite managed. The whole ecosystem became faster, louder, and more fragmented, which made the kind of patient, craft-focused content that Stacey had always produced look quiet by comparison. That quietness, however, was never the same thing as irrelevance. The audience that trusted Stacey David trusted him because of consistency, and consistency is something that loudness cannot easily replicate. Viewers who had grown up watching trucks and followed him to gears did not stay because he was the most exciting personality on their screen. They stayed because they knew what they were getting and they valued it. In an environment saturated with automotive content making increasingly wild promises about drama and transformation, reliability carries real weight. Stacey never promised more than he could deliver, never pretended that builds were simpler than they were, and never treated the audience as passive consumers who just needed to be entertained until the next commercial break. That approach builds a kind of loyalty that rating snapshots do not always capture accurately. His legacy is not most accurately measured in viewership numbers from the peak of the trucks era or in the number of platforms currently carrying Gears content. It is more honestly measured in what his audience did after watching him. The people who tried welding for the first time because he made the process feel approachable rather than intimidating. The people who bought a project truck in rough condition because watching Copperhead come together convinced them that transformation was possible. The people who spent weekends in the garage with their kids building something together, having been inspired by a host who consistently communicated that the garage was a place where ordinary people could do extraordinary things with enough patience and willingness to learn. That kind of influence does not disappear when a show changes networks or loses a mainstream spotlight. It persists in the people who were changed by it. The real reason Stacey David vanished from a kind of television that most people associate with mainstream automotive entertainment is not complicated once you understand what he was actually trying to do. He was never primarily trying to be famous. He was trying to teach to build and to make the craft of working with vehicles feel accessible to people who might otherwise be intimidated by it. When the platform that gave him his largest audience started pulling in a direction that compromised those goals, he chose the goals over the platform. When a smaller, independently controlled platform allowed him to pursue those goals without interference, he chose that instead of the bigger stage that came with more strings attached. And when the media environment around him got louder and more performative, he stayed focused on the work rather than competing on terms he did not believe in. That sequence of choices reads like a disappearance from the outside, especially for anyone who only knew him from the trucks. Years and lost track of his career, when the mainstream television spotlight moved elsewhere. But from inside the logic of what Stacey David has always been about, it reads as something much closer to the opposite of disappearing. It reads as someone who figured out what mattered to him early enough to protect it when the pressure to trade it away arrived, and who had the discipline to keep protecting it even when the cost was visibility. In an industry built around the idea that maximum exposure is the only meaningful measure of success, that kind of discipline is genuinely rare. It is also, in the long run, the thing most likely to produce work that actually lasts. The garage never left Stacey David. And if you look carefully enough, Stacey David never really left the garage either. He just stopped letting the circus set up outside it.